Have you ever thought about when you die what you want to have happen to your body? Maybe that feels morbid to think about it, but there's a point where it's appropriate for us to wonder, should I be buried as a body? Should I be cremated? Does it matter? Let's spend some time thinking about that. Hey folks, I'm Pastor Eric Tritten from Gloria Dei Lutheran Church in Hudson, Ohio, and this is a weekly word. And I'm glad you're with me because we're talking about funerals. Yay! Some years ago, I did a class on death and dying for my congregation. We talked about the process of dying. We also talked about some of the practicalities of dying, like having a will and proper preparation for your medical care and things like that. But we also spent some time talking about the funeral service itself. What can I say? I'm a fun guy and I like to have fun, so we talk about funerals. Part of that conversation in that class, we talked about what to do with the body when somebody dies. And we talked about burial or cremation. Now, there was a time where Christians very, very rarely were cremated. We see out of Judaism a very strong sense that we want to respect the body as something that God has created, and that sensibility carried through into Christianity. And so we generally would, out of respect for God, who created the body and redeemed the body and used that body as a temple of the Holy Spirit, we would bury the body rather than burning it. And this stood in contrast to the culture that the Christians lived in at the time, especially early, in the Roman time period. Their tradition, their culture was that they would cremate the dead. And this was especially the case, like I said, in Rome, at the heart of what would become Christendom. And so how you handle your dead becomes, in a sense, a confession of faith at that time. And burial was in some ways seen like an act of defiance, an act of defiance against death, saying this is not the end, but it's also kind of a confession of faith. God created the person, God redeemed that body, God used that body for his purposes, God made that body a temple of the Holy Spirit, all of that wonderful stuff. And so there was a confession of faith in burying a body. Now, a long time ago, when I started in the ministry, I would say that the funerals that I did, probably only 10 or 20%, maximum 20%, were with cremation. It was very rare to have a funeral where the body had been cremated. And as part of that class, I made a statement where I said that I very much prefer to bury a body. And I think that there are good reasons for that, partly the confession stuff that I talked about earlier. But there's also a beautiful piece of the liturgy that happens graveside, where the pastor places his hand on the casket and says, may God the Father who created this body, may God the Son who by his blood redeemed this body, may God the Holy Spirit who by holy baptism made this body to be his temple, keep these remains to the day of the resurrection of all flesh. There's just all of that resurrection type of language, and I think that's beautiful to think about how God has created us and how that whole process of redemption and sanctifying, making holy, and all of that comes together in the physicality of our lives. See, it's not just that our souls go off and we're more soul than body. We are both soul and body, and we're meant to be both together. But when I said I prefer to bury a body, I created some angst for my hearers. You see, they had already planned, some of them, their funerals, and they had planned to be cremated. And today, when I come to funerals, I would guess that probably 80% of the funerals that I do are with cremation. So is cremation wrong? That's the question I was being asked. And I got to be honest here. I mean, the Bible doesn't say that it is. So no, I don't want to bind anybody's conscience. I don't want anybody to feel bad. It's not a sin to be cremated or any of those things. Practically speaking, people die in a lot of different ways. And our bodies get destroyed in a lot of different ways too. Part of my family's history, one of my great 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 grandmothers, as she was immigrating to the United States from Germany, died across the Atlantic, and they buried her at sea. And I promise you, there's nothing left of that body. It's been completely dissolved, by the ocean. When you think about the history of the world, you've got wars and accidents that mutilate and destroy bodies and leave nothing behind. And our confession as we deal with death has always been that God can raise the dead no matter what's left of the body. He creates from nothing, and he can raise from nothing. But I still prefer burying a body as opposed to cremating. And I think we should look at some of the reasons why. Some people prefer cremation, some people prefer the burial. So the choice to cremate is often made out of pragmatism. And I'm not saying that that's wrong or that's bad, but there is a reality, an economic reality, that cremation tends to be a bit cheaper. But there are some things that go with that are a little bit uncomfortable and I don't think are good. If you've been to a funeral home recently and there was a cremation, they will show you where they can take some of the ashes and they can make them into jewelry for you. And you can wear literally it says, you can wear a piece of your loved one with you at all times. I'm not sure that that's good. I'm not sure that that's healthy. Sometimes when we have cremations, people will keep the cremains. That urn sits on a shelf somewhere, time into eternity, and they walk by and there's grandma in there. I'm not sure that that's good either. Death brings a separation, and we don't keep the dead with us all the time, apart from in our memories. And so some people try to find comfort in keeping their loved one close, but in this life, death separates us from those we love. And when we look for comfort, it's better to look to Jesus, the living one, for that comfort. To look to Jesus, the one who overcomes death for your loved one and for you. And then to look forward to a reunion in heaven with those that we love who went before us in the faith. And I think that it's helpful to have a clear break to allow us to mourn better, to allow us to experience the sorrow and the sadness, and then to give that over to Jesus in hope. I think one of the most difficult times in most of the funerals that I've done with a body is when the casket comes out and it goes into the back of the hearse and the door closes. That's a very, very sad moment. It's a hard moment. But I also think it's a good and it's an important moment to say, my loved one is no longer with me, and I must look forward to when Jesus raises the dead for my hope. I also like burying a body because, well, God created our bodies, and our bodies are gifts. We often don't think about our bodies as gifts. They're just kind of this biological matter that cases us. And that's not the biblical description of who we are. God created us to be both soul and body. Bodies matter. And this is an important part of our attitude toward life and toward death. I heard a story one time about a woman whose son died. And she's standing there next to the casket, and somebody was trying to comfort her and says, that's not your little boy. That's just a body. And the mother says, but I hugged that body, and I washed that body, and I tucked that body in, and that is my little boy. It's painful to think about that, but it's also right. We only know each other through these bodies. This is the way that God has given us to interface with each other. I don't know you in your spirit. You don't know me in my spirit. But you might recognize my face, and I might recognize yours. We might recognize the gait of our walk. We might recognize the way that we stand. All of those things, they're connected to the body. This is how God created us. It's a rather Gnostic idea. Gnosticism is an old heresy, that the spirit matters and bodies do not. We're both. We're both soul and body. And the resurrection restores the soul to a new and living body. And I love the image that we get in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where it talks about the body being kind of like seeds that go into the ground, and what comes up is more magnificent than what went in. You know, the brokenness of our bodies goes into the ground, and we are raised imperishable, eternally living. And so I think we should consider a little bit more often burying bodies, because I also see in our culture that there are some changes that are going on where the culture is becoming more and more like the pagan days of old. People say that our culture is secular. I'm not so sure about that. There are elements of it that are secular, but I can see a strain in their spirituality that has a lot more to do with paganism than Christianity or secularism. And to be sure, there are a lot of people out there who think that death is just the end and there's nothing after that. But there are a lot of people out there who believe that when we die, there's this disembodied afterlife. And, you know, maybe that's heaven, maybe it's wandering the earth, maybe it's going to a different dimension. There's a lot of people who believe these things. And a funeral with a burial, it's a confession of faith. Now, whether we're burying cremains or we're burying a body, the message is going to be the same. The wages of sin is death. And that's how we got to this place of sadness and sorrow. And yet, Christ has died, he is risen from the dead, and his salvation is real for this person, for this body, for these cremains, or for me and you. And we live in light of the resurrection, that death will be defeated and we will live because Jesus has defeated death. So whether you choose burial or you choose cremation, I can see it both ways, but make sure that part of what you're confessing in that moment is that Jesus wins the victory, and that the Christian receives the victory that Jesus has won for them, and that there's hope for all of those who are gathered because Jesus has won the victory for us all. I hope this was helpful to you. Please, if it was, like it, share it, help other people to find it. And come back next week, as we're going to talk one more time, this time about eulogies. Have a blessed week.